If you really want to hear about it, the first thing you'll probably want to know is where I was born and what my lousy childhood was like and how my parents were occupied and all before they had me and all that David Copperfield kind of crap. But I don't feel like going into it if you want to know the truth. That is the opening lines to J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. Rest in peace, Mr. Salinger. This week's theme is childhood. I think my parents don't like it when I talk about my childhood on the internet. What I'm going to do is just tell one story that I believe shaped me into who I am today. So, I had goats when I was a kid. Pygmy goats, Tabitha and Carlton. This is me with Tabitha. This is Carlton. Baby Carlton. And Tabitha. I loved these goats. I loved them. I took such good care of them, even though I was a kid. I would come home early from my friend's house if I spent the night and feed my goats. Cut branches off trees and bring them different kinds of greens. One day I went outside to feed my goats and Baby was dead. I woke up my dad, which you weren't supposed to do at my house because he worked nights. Dad, my goat's dead. And then I went to school. And I remember that day at school. Took a test on what you're supposed to do for a sprained ankle. RICE, rest, ice, compression, elevation. Mnemonic for what you do with a sprained ankle is intertwined with this memory of my dead childhood goat. The next day, I go outside to feed the remaining goat. My dead goat is still there. So I told my mom the next day there was still a dead goat in my backyard. Hello, can anyone hear me? I was a kid. I didn't know what to do with a dead goat in the middle of winter. I still wouldn't really know. And there was still a living goat who was out there freaking out, trying to share living space with her dead baby. Ugh. My dad took care of the goat, and the next day he told me he was too fat, and what I had done was overfed him, and he exploded, and that is how he died. My response to the statement regarding my role in the death of my pet goat was, well, at Storyland there was a petting zoo, and people fed those goats all day, and those goats were fine. His response, people only think baby goats are cute, so they let you overfeed the baby goats so that they can just get more baby goats. Oh my God! Any skepticism I had was completely out the door. I 100% believed. I spent the next 10 years avoiding petting zoos. It wasn't until really 10 years later that I learned that goats need to be dewormed a lot. They're susceptible to internal parasites, especially in woodsy areas like where I grew up. On top of that, I got a lot of experience with dead bodies and recognizing steps in the decaying process. The dead goat that my dad saw 3 days after he died was quite bloated, because that's what happens when animals die. Their stomach expands. And also, when an animal has internal parasites, their stomach gets distended and they look enormous. So I understand why my dad thought that what I had done was overfed my goats until they died. But for your information, that can't happen. I don't know if Tabitha died because of internal parasites as well, or if she just died because it was the middle of a cold Maine winter and I wasn't feeding her enough because I thought I would kill her if I did. Either way, I'm carrying some guilt on this one. It was a pretty huge weight off my back when I learned you can't eat until you explode. So it's my turn to choose a theme. Because this is Nerdfighters International, I would like everyone to discuss where you're from. Anything about where you're from. But at some point in the video, I would like you to point to a map. So next week, where are you at? By the by, overfeeding your goldfish will kill it. But that's not because your goldfish is going to eat all of the food. It's because the food decays and it needs oxygen to decay, and it breaks down into nitrogen, and eventually the dissolved oxygen levels in the water are too low for your fish to survive. He didn't eat until he died. That really doesn't happen ever. See you next week, Nerdfighters.